Now, to wrap up our discussion of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, first of all, note here in the slide that in the last bullet, not all colonials supported independence. In fact, a significant fraction, that is up to 20%, of the colonial population disagreed with all this revolutionary talk. And they referred to themselves as loyalists or Tories, or another name that was used to describe those who oppose independence was the King's Friends. Now, you may ask who tended to reject independence and oppose any sort of revolutionary activity. Well, usually loyalists were those colonials who had some kind of established relation with either, the government and parliament or with business. Okay, if you were a successful business person involved in commerce, that was involved in that transatlantic trade system that we've constantly referred to, then you tended to be suspicious about revolutionary talk. Now, those persons were typically found in port cities, right, along the seaboard of, the 13 colonies. All right, now look at bullet 4 here, and it states that in 1775, Paine's ideas were not common sense, so to say. All right, and that is absolutely true. And moreover, this is why Thomas Paine's choice of a title, Common Sense that is a brilliant idea. Okay, this is a brilliant title. Why? Because as I mentioned, when Paine wrote this and when it was published in January 1776, in that month, his ideas were not common sense, even though he's calling them common sense, right? His ideas, such as republicanism, rejecting the divine right of kings, natural rights, etc., these are not common sense ideas when the first publication came out in January 1776. And when I say common sense, I emphasize the word common, as in the common person, the person of ordinary rank. So what's so brilliant is that Thomas Paine really believed that the ideas in his book would indeed become common sense to everyone. In fact, as I mentioned, his ideas became common sense in just a few months after the publication of his book, which tilted the colonial opinion towards revolution. And when we think about it, today, right, when we think about these ideas like rejection of monarchy, natural rights, most people in our country today believe in this, right? Stated otherwise, they're no longer radical. They're no longer controversial or revolutionary or, anything of that sort. Rather, you could consider them as common sense, so to say. So that's how you know a true revolution in thinking has happened. When a true paradigm shift in, thinking is established. That is to say, when something that was once considered radical becomes, quote, common sense. So, with the immense popularity and public support growing for independence after the publication of Common Sense, even the vanguard of leadership, known as our founding fathers, also had a change in mind. So this brings us to the actual declaration itself, the official pronouncement of that stance that says, yes, we are now pursuing independence. And by the way, this obviously entails committing to a war against the mightiest empire in the world. Now, hopefully you remember that Thomas Jefferson was the main author of really this great piece of literature that has been accorded much admiration and influence, really. It's important to note that Jefferson always acknowledged Thomas Paine as being the person whose work actually had that galvanizing effect upon the country. The spirit of 76, so to say. It was Thomas Paine's work that Jefferson himself acknowledged. In fact, Jefferson that is, mentioned that the Declaration of Independence that he authored was simply the expression of the American mind at that time. And that expression of the American mind was molded by Thomas Paine. All right, so what we need to do is look over this declaration and pick out certain key ideas, certain key points that are being made. And much of this hopefully will be seen by you in a new light, given the fact that we've discussed colonial history since the early 1600s. We've discussed various things like, the colonies never having a pure feudalism, the colonies having a more decentralized approach to government, and other things like religion, right? Salutary neglect, and the level of democratization in the colonies compared to that of Europe. Okay, all of this will be reflected in our reading of the Declaration of Independence. So it begins here in Congress, July 4th, 1776. Now, by the way, I should mention this, that July 4th is when our leaders officially and publicly announce independence. But the decision was actually made on July 2nd, 2 days prior. So when you think about it, we kind of celebrate the wrong day. But putting that aside, here's the first sentence, which is chock full of cutting-edge ideas here. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. All right, so hopefully you could pick out what is being argued here. He's basically stating this. In history, sometimes there emerges circumstances or moments whereby you see the necessity whereby one people must separate from another. In this case, that is to say the North American colonies, it's the people of the North American colonies dissolving that relationship with the rest of the English Empire. So this is what they mean by it's necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, as stated here. So here Jefferson even invokes this idea of nature, right? The laws of nature. And he even invokes nature's God, because, back then you can't be entirely secular. In any case, he does invoke nature, and we've been talking about this all the way back to the Enlightenment thinking, right? Natural rights as opposed to having no rights. So again, you see this appeal to nature. And also, here's an important part. When he mentions a decent respect to the opinions of mankind. What is he saying here? Well, this is crucial because Jefferson is stating that this argument is based on the people, or to use our term, the commoner. When he uses the opinions of mankind, that phrase, putting aside the gendered phraseology, right? Just think of, humankind. Could be a 21st century substitute. In any case, what he's saying is the opinions of humankind matter. Okay, you have to respect it. You can't just ignore it like the kings did in the past, like emperors did. And today, our term for this is public opinion, right? So he's saying that public opinion matters. And this goes all the way back to our discussion of the public sphere, whereby public opinion is forged. So here, Jefferson is rejecting that feudal view wherein public opinion really doesn't matter, right? It's the king that's sovereign, the queen, the emperor, what have you. But Jefferson is saying that you have to respect popular opinion. You can't brush it aside. And in a way, he's saying that the people are sovereign. And, when those circumstances arise, which entails separation from one people from another, then public opinion should declare the causes, as he mentions here, which impel them to separation. In other words, he's saying that you can't just separate because you feel like it. You have to have justification. You should declare the causes which impel you to do so. And when you think about cause, what you're really talking about here is evidence. He's saying that, okay, we colonials, we have to separate from the mother country. And then you ask, well, why? And then you have to supply the evidence, which, let me just scroll further down here. Most of this document is a list of evidence as to why they need to separate, starting from here, right? Going all the way down. In fact, as I just mentioned, this constitutes most of the document itself. All these reasons, right? Okay, so the next part is as follows, and this is probably the most well-known part of the Declaration. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." So at this point, what Jefferson's doing is setting up his argument. And he begins with premises. We hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning they can't be refuted, right? They are inherently true. In a way, he's following the methodology of Enlightenment thinkers here, because during the Enlightenment, the philosophers and the scientists believe in a truth that was irrefutable, just like scientific laws, right? You can't refute them. And he's carrying that way of thinking into the social world, that no matter what, they are true. And what are these things that are true, that are self-evident, right? Well, that all men are created equal, and that they're endowed with God with certain unalienable rights. And again, that's another term for natural rights, unalienable rights. And then you may ask, what are these unalienable rights, Jefferson? Well, it's these: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these are the rights that you can't take away from anyone. That's why they're unalienable and natural. And as he goes on, he talks about how governments, the purpose of a government is to ensure that these rights are secured and protected. That's why you form governments in the first place, at least the modern way of thinking, right? The post-monarchical way of thinking, if you will, right? The function of government, again, is to protect people's rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, one key phrase here is this, that governments, quote, derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Right? So this is a radical idea back then. And it's basically stating this, contrary to, say, divine right of kings, where kings are appointed by God, or maybe they receive it through inheritance, right? In this case, the power of the ruler is derived from the ruled. Okay? The ruled give their consent to the ruler to rule over them, right? So this is something that's new. In fact, it's a form of mutual understanding, right? Mutual agreement that the ruled provide their consent to the ruler to rule over them.